In this video, we're going to look at the introduction to the squat. So we're going to break it into a few sections, number one being the purpose, number two being how to assess, where we'll look at different progressions to assess and also go through a checklist to identify errors. We're then going to look at movement adaptations that you can make to the squat, and finally finish off with the key takeaways of the video. So to begin with, the purpose. So the squat is all about strengthening the legs through a large range of movement. You're developing muscle around the glutes, quads and adductors, which is the inner thigh area. And in terms of as a movement pattern, it allows us to move into low positions or flex positions where our knees are coming towards our torso, and to be able to produce force from them positions. So for example, pushing a car, coming down to pick something up, or picking something nice and low off the floor and driving that up to standing, or even if we're sort of driving someone onto our shoulders or picking someone up to carry them. These are all patterns where we'll be working through our squat. So in terms of assessing, we're going to look at 3 different progressions to work through, and the idea is with this is we try and perform the checklist with one progression, and if we're able to do that, we can work on to the next and the next. And this might take a few weeks to do. You might find you can do it in a day, it just all seems to be really seamless for you, but in most cases it might take a few sessions or a few weeks to work through this. So to start with, the first progression is looking at with the hands in front of you, performing a squat. So what I'll do first is I'll just show you the movement, and then from there we can start to work through the checklist. When we're performing this movement, so hands in front squat, okay, we want the feet to be roughly hip width, okay, and you can either have your toes facing forwards or you can have a little bit of turnout if that feels a little bit more comfortable, okay. From there you're standing nice and tall with the gaze forwards, the arms are going to reach out in front of you, you're going to control down into your squat, try and break parallel, so get your thigh bones to be either in line or just below parallel with the floor, and then stand yourself back up. Control down. And what you do is perform 10 repetitions here. I'm going to be doing 5 from this angle, so ideally filming yourself so you can then look at your checklist. 5 from this angle, followed by 5 from this angle. Okay, so now we can start to work through our checklist, and what the checklist will do is help you to understand the technical aspects of the squat, and then you'll be able to start to look and identify if you're able to perform these checklists effectively and well, or if there's some errors occurring and things that you might have to work on in terms of your skill or working on your range of motion or other aspects like that going forwards to improve your squat. So to start with, the most important I would say is your trunk position, okay? So as we're performing the squat, we want the neck to be behind the toes, okay? So if you're looking from the side, you can see as you come down, we want that neck to be either behind the toes or roughly in line with the midfoot, okay? So sort of this region here, okay? If what's happening is that neck's traveling right in front of the toes, what's then gonna happen is we're not gonna load the legs as much, we're gonna load more into the back, and we're not really gonna be able to develop that leg drive and take them knees through a large range of motion, okay? So the most important one to start with, guys, is that trunk position. The second of the checklist is going to be your foot position. As we're performing our squat, okay, we want to make sure that the feet are doing 2 things. 1, they're fully in contact with the floor, and 2, they're not spinning out as we're lowering ourselves down. So to start with the contact, as we're coming down, we want to feel that nice foot pressure through the floor. So the balls of the feet are through the floor, we can feel the toes and the heels through the floor. What can happen is as we're lowering down, we can pop up onto the heels, okay, and we can lose that control, lose that base support and balance that we're able to create when we've got a full foot contact, and then ultimately it leads to less ability to produce force and potentially excessive loading on joints like the knees. The second thing that can happen with the feet is they can start to spin out, okay, so as we're lowering ourselves down, the feet can start to spin, and it can start to put our hips and knees into sort of a compromised position, again where we're not able to produce force effectively through the ground. Next on the checklist is the knees. Now the reason why I covered the feet first is because I think the feet essentially, if we're able to get that right, it usually makes the knees work quite well in our squat, okay, but I will cover it now just to make sure. So as we're performing our squat, what we want to be doing as a principle is keeping the knees, the centre of the kneecap, okay, or the centre of the knee in line with the middle 2 toes. Okay, and that's the position that we're looking for as we're performing the squat on the way down, if we're pausing, or when we're coming back up as well. So common errors that you might see with the knees, they might be dropping in as you're squatting down, okay, and you'll see them come to the inside, and then what will happen here is the foot will then collapse, okay, we'll roll into the inside of the foot, and maybe even the outside of the foot will start to come up off the floor. Okay, another thing that can happen with the knees is as we're coming down, they can actually push too far out, and we can roll into the outside of the foot, and actually the ball of the feet and the first toe can also start to roll off the floor as well. So again, it's really important that we keep the knees tracking in line with the middle two toes on the full squat movement. So number 4 on the checklist is going to be depth. Okay, now squat depth is definitely something that there's some differences from person to person. Some people will find it really easy to sit into a nice deep squat, and that can be based on flexibility in the hips and ankles, but it can also be based on ratios as well in terms of the length of the femurs, length of tibias, and length of the torso as well. So these things can make a difference, which is why with depth, it's a relatively flexible checklist, okay, or principle to the squat that we adhere to. Some people again will find it easy. Some people we might have to say, don't worry about going to parallel, just work to this depth, and then maybe in time we can progress that. But general rule of thumb, guys, for most people is going to be that we want to be able to squat to at least thighs parallel with the floor, okay, and that'll be a standardized depth that we could work to, okay. If you're someone who finds that really comfortable and you're able to stay in a nice trunk position here, then we could start to work a little bit lower, okay, and try to get into a lower squat position, providing that we're able to still keep to the prior principles or prior checklist points. But essentially, that's what we're looking for at least a parallel squat depth. And the ways in which you can start to work with that is obviously you can record the video and see if you're getting there, but then we can also start to look at some of the movement adaptations that we'll discuss shortly, such as using a box, and that can help us to understand where the depth actually needs to be. When it comes to depth, the reason why it's quite an important thing is obviously when it comes to range of motion, the deeper we go in a squat, the further we're going to take our joints through a full range of motion. So the knees, the hips, the more they travel into a lower position, the more we're going to lengthen the muscles, stimulate that adaptation for them to grow and get stronger through that full range. So essentially the reason why depth is something that we do work on prioritizing and we do discuss it in our checklist is because the more depth we can get with good positions and keeping to the principles of a good squat, the more muscle we're going to be able to stimulate, more muscle fibers are going to be able to stimulate. Okay, the final checklist is going to be hip alignment. So you can check this one either from the front or from behind, okay, but essentially when we're going down in our squat, what can start to happen is some people will shift to the side and they'll put more weight onto one leg. That could be because of an injury in one side, that could be because of some range of motion limitations in one side, or it could just be a pattern they've learned from prior injury or prior lack of range of motion in the past. As we're squatting, we obviously want to be keeping a nice even position. Okay, the shins should be in the same line as we come down, so one shouldn't be off to the side or to the inside. If we look at them from this angle, the shins should be pointing up in the same way. Okay, and also if we look from the back, we shouldn't see the hips drifting over to one foot more than the other. Okay, we should be able to see that the hips are nicely settled over both the feet and there's none of that shift from side to side. Okay, so again, you might need to take, well, you will need to take a video of this one from the front or from the back if you can't quite see from the front. But in terms of working with the hip alignment, one of the best things that you can do is use a mirror, and then you get that instantaneous feedback about the position that you're in. So once you've gone through the first of the assessments with the hands out in front, you can then move on to the second, which is going to be with the hands on the head, okay? So essentially you're gonna get into that same squat position, okay? Bare feet or in socks if I haven't already said that, just to make sure you're actually getting that feedback between your feet and the floor. And from there, you're gonna place the hands behind the head, okay? Stay nice and upright and perform your squat as you did before, okay? So all the same checklist we're gonna work through and all the same principles apply here, okay? Stay nice and tall, controlling our way down before bringing it back up, okay? If you have access to a barbell and you know you're going to be doing some back squats, okay, this might not be for all of you, but some of you will be doing that. What you can do is you can use a stick here, okay, so hands on head can be substituted with a stick. They're both quite similar in terms of the position that they're going to put us into. From there, we want to have the hands at about shoulder width, okay, squeezing the shoulder blades together, and then we're resting that stick on the sort of nice muscular part of our traps, okay, which is just underneath our neck. And then from there we form the squat in that position as well. So that could be an alternative to doing the hands on head. So when you're performing that progression, again, you'd be taking 5 reps from the front, okay, and 5 reps from the side. You'd be looking at them, so you'd be taking them on the video, you'd be looking at them and thinking, right, am I working through the checklist here? Okay, if you see that you're not able to perform one of the points in the checklist, then you can always, have another attempt, video it again, and see if you're able just to, with a bit more awareness, work in and be able to do that effectively. And from there, the final progression, or the final assessment progression, is going to be a front-loaded squat. So you've gone through the hands in front, you've gone through the hands on the head, you've built that proficiency with your squat, you're now starting to think, okay, I'm gonna add a little bit of load. So to begin with, you're just gonna start with something nice and light. This could be a dumbbell, a plate, a kettlebell, a medicine ball, anything like this, okay? And to begin with, all you're gonna do is you're gonna get in that exact same squat stance that you've created, and then you're gonna press the weight out in front. Okay, this will give you a nice bit of counterbalance, but it'll also increase the load a little bit through the extensor muscles and also obviously into the legs as well. And from here, same again. Again, you do 5 reps from the side, 5 reps from the front, videoing them, having a look. And if it's very competent for you, what you can start to do is bring the weight in. Okay, and if we're able to get the weight in here, we're gonna have less counterbalance, but we're still gonna feel that load through the legs. And if we're able to form this proficiently, we can then start to look, okay, we've assessed the squat movement, we've looked at the mechanics of it, we're able to perform it well, we can now actually start to test our performance within the squat. And this is where we can start to look at our goblet squat, which is essentially holding the weight in this position and performing a 10 repetition max. So for the goblet squat, what we can do is we can take a kettlebell or a dumbbell or a plate. We want to have our elbows in nice and tight, okay? Keeping the weight in nice and close to us. And from here, we perform 10 reps at a specific weight. And the idea of this test, guys, is we're trying to look for the heaviest weight that we can do for 10 really high quality reps. So keeping to the checklist, keeping the first rep exactly the same as the last rep. Okay, if we do start to lose our technique, put the weight down safely and choose a lighter weight to find your 10 rep maximum for your goblet squat. Okay, so there we've looked at our assessment, we've gone through our squat progressions, we've got to a point where we're actually able to test our performance within the goblet squat, which is probably the easiest variation of a loaded squat to begin with. So now we can look at our movement adaptations. So once we've worked through the assessment, we've got to a point where we're testing our performance within the goblet squat, we can then start to look at, okay, as we go through our squat journey, what are different ways we can adapt the movement? So the first thing we can look at is stance. So we said in the assessment that we can have our feet at about hip width with a slight bit of turnout, okay? This is the kind of general rule of thumb, but you may find that depending on what you're trying to use a squat for and depending on how it feels, you might want to actually adopt a different stance. So generally, a narrower stance is going to target more your quads. Okay, whereas a wide stance is going to work more into the adductors, the inner thighs. Okay, so that's some ways you can adopt it. But also you've got to start to play around and think, okay, in a squat position, what feels good for me? What feels stable around the hips? What feels good for loading the legs? And so on and so forth. Next up, we can look at depth. Okay, so depth is something that we can manipulate. Okay, so as I said in the assessment, we want to be trying to work to get into parallel or below. Okay, but some people might find if, for example, you might have arthritis in your hips or you might have something like FAI, you might have to limit your depth a little bit to parallel or even slightly above. Okay, so in some cases it might actually just be okay to work to, maybe just above that parallel position. You might still feel like you load the legs and feel the glutes and quads and adductors working, but you might just be having to limit that depth. Okay, and you can start to play with things like boxes and pins in order to modulate the depth and keep it as kind of keep it as an objective depth that you're actually working to. So for example, with your squat, what you can start to look at is doing something like a box squat where you've got a bench or a box there, you're lowering down onto it and back up, and that way that depth standardized. You can also do the same thing with pins. So you could be in a squat position with your barbell on your back, okay, or in your front rack position, lowering down until you touch the pins and then driving back off that pin position. So actually with the pins, you're coming down, you're offloading the weight, so you're taking that tension out of the bar, letting it rest on the pins, and then really forcefully driving up out of that bottom position. So it's also quite an interesting adaptation that you can make to the squat. Another adaptation that we really like to add in there for lots of people is the heel raise. And for some people, even they might be working through the assessment, they might find it really, really difficult to actually give them checklists a tick. For example, leaning really far forwards or letting the heels raise up. In that case, we'll often say, okay, let's try it with a little bit of a heel raise. And what you can do is just take a few little wedges or even books or some sort of step that you've got at home. Okay, it only wants to be a few inches. But from there, just by propping them heels up a little bit and allowing the heels to rest on the wedges, it'll allow you potentially to squat a lot more upright and really feel like you can load the legs more and hit more depth. So heel raise is a really nice variation for some people in order to get into a nice good squat position, but that's not to say that everyone needs to be doing it. Next up, we can start to look at the tempos. Okay, so if when we're performing a squat, we're performing something like a 5-second lower, so we're in this position, lowering down, really controlling that lower before coming back up. What this will do is give us a little bit more time to recognize the balance and start to really feel that length happening through our glutes, through our quads. So adding something like a slow lower can be a really nice way of challenging our squat in a different way without necessarily adding more load, and also giving us a little bit more time to feel and understand the movement. Another thing you can do is add things like pauses. Okay, so you get down to that bottom position and you pause for a handful of seconds, or even just like the halfway position. So as we're lowering down, we might stop halfway because we might sometimes feel a bit unbalanced there, and that could be a place where we put a pause as well. And also we can do things like pulses as well, where we might lower down to our bottom position, perform a few pulses, so we're really getting some understanding and building some strength in there, and then before returning to the top. The final movement adaptation that we can talk about is the loading. Okay, so we've already discussed that we can do the goblet squat, which is our front loaded variation with a kettlebell or dumbbell. What we can also do, obviously, is work through back squats with the weight resting on our traps. Okay, we can work through front squats with the weight resting on our front, or front squats with 2 kettlebells, one either side. Okay. We can also play with things like overhead squats, which are a little bit more of a complex movement, which obviously starts to bring the shoulders into play a little bit more as well. But essentially that'll be holding the weight overhead, okay, in a reasonably wide position, and then squatting down, again adhering to the same principles in that overhead squat. And we can also in the future start to play with things like squat jumps, which make them more dynamic and ballistic, and challenge our muscles in different ways, but also produce different loading patterns with a lot more acceleration on the concentric, and then obviously the large force impulse that we're going to get from the deceleration as we lower down from a jump squat. So the takeaways for this video, guys, first of all, this should have given you a nice foundational understanding of your squat. So you should be able to now look at how you'd assess it, and what the checklists you're going to be looking out for when you're doing your own squat or helping someone else with theirs. And also it should have given you a good idea of what adaptations you can make to your squat based on your current anatomy, the ability that you're working at, and also the environment around you, so what equipment you might have access to. The squat really is a great movement to be working through. It's very practical in terms of how it applies to our day-to-day life. It's quite easy to see how a squat can be used, as we're standing up off the chair, if we happen to have to push something heavy or lift something heavy low off the floor. It has a lot of utility, but also in terms of the muscular benefits that it's going to provide us, increasing the muscle mass around our legs. It's a really nice thing to have, not only from a vanity perspective, but also as we age as well. We want to be keeping good quality muscle mass in our bodies that allow us to do all the functional day-to-day tasks that we require of us, but also go off and enjoy life, whether it's sports or playing with our family or whatever it happens to be. Awesome, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video and took something away from it, and I'll see you soon.